Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent and look at some of the really life-saving services they're providing in many areas of the world. My guest is an expert on this particular organization. My guest today is Mr. Robert Mardini, who is the permanent observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the United Nations. Mr. Mardini, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's jump right into the International Committee of the Red Cross. We've all heard of the Red Cross, somewhere the Bolivian Red Cross, American Red Cross, whatever. But what is the International Committee of the Red Cross, and when were you formed, why were you formed?
Well, it was created 156 years ago, and the notion was a very simple one. It came from a trip from a Swiss businessman in Italy, where he crossed a battlefield and he saw so much suffering that he decided that wars must have limit to suffering. And that was the initial moment where the International Committee of the Red Cross was created, and then the entire movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies was formed with 191 national societies and the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. That is the secretariat of those national societies.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to your website at www.icrc.org and get more information about what we're talking about today. What is the difference? You say the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, in the two organizations together, how many countries do you operate in around the world, and how do you interface with each other?
So it's basically the same family. The family is made of the International Committee of the Red Cross, that is the founder, the national societies. So in almost each and every country there is whether a National Red Cross or a National Red Crescent Society. In Israel it's the Magen David Adom. And the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society is the secretariat trying to support national societies to face natural disasters and to build their capacity to do mitigation of those risks. The mandate of the ICRC is really armed conflict and other situations of violence. States gave us the mandate to make sure that the international humanitarian law, so the 4 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, are respected at times of wars, because they are the legal framework that limit human suffering during war.
Mm-hmm. And of course, with any professional organization of your type, or any professional organization, you've got your bylaws, you have your principles. What are some of the principles of your organization?
So our president is Mr. Peter Maurer. He's the president of the ICRC. The president of the International Federation is Francesco Rocca, and each and every national society has a president and very often a secretary general that is appointed by their respective boards. Those are independent governances for each entity of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. Mm-hmm. That is, by the way, the largest humanitarian global network on planet Earth. 80 million members and people working to alleviate human suffering for people facing the devastation of war, armed violence or natural disasters, or addressing epidemics or health hazards.
Mm-hmm. How do you interact with their various national organizations like the American Red Cross, I'm sure the Bolivian Red Cross, the Lebanese Red Cross, or Red Crescent, or whatever the case might be?
Actually, Lebanese Red Cross.
It is Red Cross. Okay, I got it the first time. Thank you. But do you interact with them at all, or are they separate? They're separate entities, but you still interface with them at some point?
There are our natural and primary partners. For the ICRC, when a conflict hits or starts, we work in close partnership with those national societies. They're volunteers, they are present on the ground, they have experience, they know the context. So there are a force multiplier for our humanitarian response, and the same happens for the International Federation in areas hit by natural disaster. They too work hand in hand with the national society. So there is very often very strong partnership on a wide array of activities, ranging from medical response to trying to support water and sanitation facilities in rural areas or urban settings, or helping separated families by conflict or natural disaster get back in touch. So these are very important activities and partnerships for us.
They certainly are, yes. Earlier you alluded to the Geneva Conventions. We hear that term quite often. Well, maybe not as often as we should hear it, I hope or think. But what are the Geneva Conventions? And of course this year they're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. What are the Geneva Conventions, and why are they important in the work that you do?
They are absolutely critical and more relevant today than ever. Those are the basic legal framework based on three important notions in armed conflict. The three principles are the principle of precaution, proportionality, and distinction, which means when states fight each other or a state fight an armed group, they need to take every precaution to make sure that civilians are protected. They have to make a clear distinction between military targets and civilian population and civilian object. And sky is not the limit as to the use of force. So, and this is the principle of proportionality in order to preserve infrastructure and civilian object and property. So the four Geneva Conventions were negotiated over a very short period, 70 years ago, of 3-4 months. So it's a huge act of multilateral diplomacy in the aftermath of the Second World War, where states agreed that there should be limit to the suffering during armed conflict. The first Geneva Convention covers the need of wounded persons on the battlefield. The second one addresses the persons when the conflict takes place on the sea. The third one is about the detainees, and the fourth one addresses the civilian population. So those are the core of what we call international humanitarian law, and they are, in simple terms, they are a safety net for dignity in war. They limit suffering of people if, of course, they are respected. So our work is not only to respond to the needs of people in terms of water, health, food, but also to make sure that states and armed groups respect those basic rules of war.
Those are very important. They're very noble goals. Do you find today, though, with the situation where you don't have two armies squaring off against each other, in many cases you have terrorist groups or rebel groups, or you have non-state actors, that do we see that there's a breakdown of the Geneva Conventions today in some areas? Or I guess what I'm asking is, are they as relevant today as they were maybe 50 years ago? Given that the whole scenario of the actors is changing quite dramatically.
Now, this is an important notion, and it is true that the nature of armed conflict has evolved over past decades, and we see that today more and more conflict are fought between states and armed groups, or coalition of states, and also sometimes a coalition of armed groups, which makes it much more complex and difficult to monitor. Having said that, I personally think that today international humanitarian law is more relevant than ever, because the alternative doesn't exist. And the principle of preserving dignity, humanity, and protect civilians in armed conflict is more true than ever. And it is true that we see day in and day out instances where this law is violated, when a hospital is being attacked, where ambulances are being shot at, where entire neighborhoods are being targeted. But at the same time, my colleagues and the ICRC has 19,000 staff working in 80 countries. They also have many stories of instances where international humanitarian law works. Every time my colleagues are able to cross a front line to deliver aid, medical aid or food, or repair a water pumping station in an area controlled by an armed group, crossing front line, negotiating with the parties to the conflict in order to get there. Every time detainees are treated humanely, every time separated families are put back in touch, every time missing persons in conflict, their fate has been clarified because there is cooperation between two formerly warring sides. It shows that this framework works and needs to be reinforced, and of course much more needs to be done to make it work even better.
And you're quite right. We do need the Geneva Conventions more today than possibly 50 years ago. We needed them then, we still need them today. Well, let's take a couple of cases and look at what are you doing, let's say in Syria right now. We've seen the immense suffering. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people have been dislocated, and that terrible war has been going on 8 years now or something like that. What is ICRC doing in that area to provide assistance?
Syria is, I would say, sadly and tragically, our largest operation in terms of budget and human capital. We do a lot of things there. We are present in many places in the country, supporting water utilities, for instance, to provide water for the people. Since the beginning of this year, close to 8 million persons got access to clean water thanks to the work of the ICRC and the Syrian Red Crescent Society. We also support medical centers. We support physical rehabilitation center, trying to fit people who have been amputated because of the conflict, for instance, and provide and support in providing physio services so that people get back some mobility. We also support people stranded in camps, internally displaced camps, or centers hosting people displaced. There has been so many displaced people in Syria. More than 6 million people have been displaced internally, many of them more than one time. It's interesting to hear from our colleagues today, having testimonies from people who have fled recently the conflict in northern Hama, in the province of Idlib. People tend to forget how many times they were displaced. A man said it is maybe the 5th time or the 6th time. I don't remember well. 8 years, many times moving, leaving everything behind in catastrophic conditions for families, having houses destroyed because of the violence of the conflict is really problematic. We also run together with the Norwegian Red Cross Society and the Syrian Red Crescent field hospital in Al-Hol camp in northeast Syria, where close to 75,000 persons are living today in very difficult conditions.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of a PBS or community access television station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website or a computer, you like our shows, and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at the International Committee of the Red Cross and some of the great work it's doing around the world. My guest today is talking about that, Mr. Robert Mardini, who is the permanent observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the United Nations. We've talked about Syria. Let's look at one other area. It's lethal the Ebola virus. We saw that not too many years ago in 4 or 5 major African countries. What are you doing in that area? How prevalent is that problem today? It's such a lethal disease, and it can get out of control so fast. What are you doing to help control that?
Well, the biggest challenge in DRC is the fact that the disease is taking place precisely where the conflict is taking place, which makes the response to control the spread of the epidemic much more difficult. North and South Kivu, the Ituri provinces are really hard hit by the conflict, and at the same time the epidemic now is playing out for more than a year. Moreover, there is a spread beyond the borders of DRC. There has been a couple of cases in Uganda, and there is the risk of further spread, which is of course a matter of grave concern for communities and countries surrounding in the neighborhood of the DRC. So we work together with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, ICRC, and the Congolese Red Cross. We try support communities hit by the epidemic, for instance, in terms of dealing with the human remains of loved ones who have been contaminated in order to control the spread of the epidemic. We also train communities to help them prevent being exposed to the disease. But the task is huge, and the challenge is really massive. And of course, the fact that the conflict is playing out makes it extremely difficult to respond. We're not the only ones. Others are responding, MSF and other organizations, but the
Doctors Without Borders.
Without Borders.
Yeah.
But the combination of all efforts today fall short of the magnitude of the problem, unfortunately.
It certainly does, yes. Now, so many of the experts have documented very well that climate change is our #1 problem. The climate is changes. Now, they're saying it's not climate change, it's climate change crisis. We are into it, and we're into it on steroids, it seems like. How does this factor, the fact that climate is changing dramatically, adversely in almost every country on the planet, how does that tie into your work? Is that a contributing factor to creating situations of conflict, to creating refugees, to creating poverty? How does that play in what you're doing?
It is certainly a factor that is exacerbating problems of communities, because we witness in many locations today, be it in the Middle East, Yemen, but also in Africa, the Lake Chad region, the Sahel, we see an interplay between armed violence, conflict, and the consequences of climate change or environmental degradation. And it is a vicious circle, because it is today hard to establish that the consequences of climate change have triggered a conflict as being the only parameter have triggered the conflict. But clearly, it is further exposing communities to more vulnerability. Their coping mechanisms are severely weakened, and of course, when you have less water, less natural resources, this encourages maybe some communities or ethnic tensions to be fueled and to make a conflict even more deep and more difficult to solve politically. So we see this happening in many places. To give an example, I mean, in the northern part of Yemen, the water table is declining by 7 meters per year. So the exploitation of the water resources are much higher than what the nature is giving up. And this is not playing out in a vacuum. It's playing out in one of the most violent conflicts on Earth. which of course will exacerbate the dynamic between the communities, the fighting itself, and will of course trigger more displacement of population and hardship for people and communities.
And you're absolutely right. We're seeing the water situation is just absolutely devastating. We see the glaciers are melting in the Altiplano, and every country's under stress, it seems like, with water. In Australia, you've got raging fires on one side of the continent, and you have inundation on the other side with heavy rains. But in the last couple of minutes that we have, what do you see as one or two of the major challenges that you're going to have as you move forward?
Well, I think certainly one challenge is this interplay between climate change and conflict, because we see the problem deepening, and we will need to be more present and reinforce and strengthen our humanitarian response to this in order to help communities face this double challenge and this double vulnerability that it's exposed to. Another one is maybe an issue that is not very visible on the TV screens: mental health and psychosocial support. We see from our interaction with communities and people who come to health centers that we support that this is a critical problem that is maybe not visible, but that hits every single family which suffered whether displacement or direct consequences of conflict, and we need to really step up our psychosocial and mental health programs to support people and help them recover their realities and situation. Another challenge is the use of weapons, and what you mentioned earlier in your introduction about the fact that there are so many different armed groups and states fighting. I think we have reached an unprecedented level of transfer of weapons. There has never been as much weapons transferred since the Second World War, and we see this is this consequence on communities when weapons are not transferred in a responsible way. They generate more suffering, more destruction, and more hardship on communities. So we need to also scale up our diplomatic outreach in order to make sure that countries selling weapons to other countries or to armed groups in one country or the other do this in a responsible way with the strings attached. There shouldn't be any transfer of weapon for any party to the conflict not respecting the basic rules of war. And there are treaties for that, and we really encourage all countries to ratify those treaties, such as the Armed Trade Treaty. That is a simple one that has been adopted 6 years ago, where we need more states to ratify and to respect those very simple principles.
In the last 40 seconds or so we have left, who are some of your major partners? You mentioned Doctors Without Borders, folks like that. Do you interface with the United Nations agencies? Do you partner with them or collaborate, coordinate?
We coordinate, absolutely. I mean, the ICRC and the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement is try to be impartial and neutral. Very often the United Nations has also a political agenda, which is understandable. This is why we need to be extremely careful when we interact, but there is coordination taking place in all contexts because we need to make sure that the very often limited resources are used in an optimal way for people affected by conflict and disaster. So we interact with the UN agencies such as UNHCR,
High Commissioner for Refugees,
yes, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and others.
Well, it's really remarkable work that you're doing, and usually under some very adverse conditions. This is not a day at the beach when you're providing services and helping people to get their lives, first off, to keep them alive, secondly, to help them get their lives back on track. And it's extremely important work that you're doing in conjunction with these other agencies that you talked about and these other groups. And as you move forward, we're going to have even more challenges, as you mentioned, with the situation with the climate change, with this as you mentioned also, the flow of guns around the world is just frightening. And it will take all the countries of the world to come together, and they can do it at the United Nations. The 193 countries at the UN General Assembly can come together to focus attention on these problems, which they have done for many, many years and will do so in the future. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.